And all right, we will hang tight and get started in just a moment. Give folks a moment to get through the Zoom void and join us here on the webinar. And then once I see some people start to trickle in, that'll be my sign to know that things are moving, and we'll go ahead and get started. All right, I see some stuff moving. People are starting to join in. So, okay, let's do it. We'll get started. Thanks so much, everyone, for going ahead to join our second session in the Annual Planning Unplugged series. So we're talking about all things annual planning and broke it up into 8 separate sections or separate days so that we can really focus in on some important topics to the annual planning process from a RevOps perspective. So for our session today, quick housekeeping notes here. Our agenda is pretty much, we'll do intros and then we'll dive into questions from the audience and let our speakers here really kind of share their expertise and insights and knowledge and war stories with everyone here. So that's pretty simple. For housekeeping, feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box at any time they come to mind, and then we'll address them as we go. There are some cool features, like you could upvote the question too if you see something that strikes your eye, to make sure that we are able to get to the questions that have the most value for the most attendees. The other thing here is if you're able to share context, that's helpful for us to make sure that we can give a relevant response. And we will share the recording and a summary of the conversation through email after the event is finished. So with that, our topic today is analysis. So last week we were talking about all things data, kind of getting your data ready to dive into the planning process. And now we're talking about analysis, looking at your past performance for the year or more, depending on what your business needs are. And how do you approach that analysis so that you can really dig through and make sense of what happened in your company and in your revenue teams in the past year. So our guests today, you have Tyler Simons and Bala Bhaskaran from the Fullcast team, and then Anthony and Rico. So I'll let Tyler and then Bala do their introductions, and then we'll hand it over to Anthony for his.
I get to go first? Oh,
yeah,
man.
because you're supposed to keep it
amazing. Tyler Simons. I'm at Fullcast. I'm the head of customer success here. And, seeing a lot of different things from many different customers. And so that's kind of the expertise and I guess the war stories I get to bring to our AMA today. And I'll pass it off to Bala.
Thank you, Tyler. It's always a hard thing to go after you, but I'll try.
Yeah.
This is Bala Bhaskaran. I'm a co-founder, CTO of Fullcast. I run product and engineering here. Like Tyler, we've been involved with a number of our customers over the past 7-8 years, helping them through their annual planning cycles. Prior to that, I was at Salesforce. I used to run the annual planning cycle at Salesforce for about 4 years. So lots of war stories, lots of examples to share. And this is a pretty interesting topic, so I'm excited to get this going. Anthony?
Yeah, thank you both for having me here today. Excited. My name is Anthony Rico. I was the head of RevOps for 3 high growth scaling tech companies. And then I started Lean Scale, which is a revenue operations as a service company for scaling technology companies. Plenty of planning war stories. I could probably share a lot of things not to do today, so you can skip any of the mistakes I've made. And it also is a landscape that's continuing to change. So the way I would do planning 3 years ago, maybe it was relevant then, but now it's totally different. And I anticipate that change to continue. So I think getting everybody on the call grounded in some frameworks that can help today and in the future is going to be really exciting.
Awesome. Thank you all for those introductions. While we're waiting for our questions from the audience to start coming in, I do have a couple that I prepared just based on what I've been reading and leading up to this session. So I'll go ahead and drop one of those for you guys to start digging into. So the first one, kind of like what you were saying, Anthony, how do you approach the analysis for annual planning? Is there a framework that you like in particular? I know sometimes, like Bala, when we talked previously, we talked about using a SWOT analysis. I'm curious, Anthony, what you can share with us from that point of view.
Yeah, I like SWOT because it mixes some strategic initiatives into the data. But if I'm looking at a framework that I use to begin collecting data, I really do everything I can to reverse engineer the funnel. So if the end state is revenue, what happened before revenue came in the door? And if I work backwards, it would be upsells, expansions, contractions, and churn. Then your bookings, then how much pipeline was created, how many leads were needed to create that pipeline, and then how much brand awareness do you need to generate those leads. And so I just always think of everything as reverse engineering that funnel. And then from there, how many times do I need to segment it? So are there different products? Are you in market in different regions? Do you serve different firmographic segments? That's usually the most important one. Enterprise operates totally different than velocity or SMB sales cycles. So I look at the funnel, reverse engineer it, and then I segment it as many ways as I can to start the data gathering process. I don't know if anybody does anything different.
No, makes sense. Makes sense. No, I think you kind of covered the big areas that I look for. So typically, when I look at sort of past analysis, there's sort of three buckets. I break them down into. The first, of course, is your distribution, right? So which is what is working in terms of the go-to-market motion itself, which is what you were alluding to, Anthony, just the pipeline, who's involved in it, how are we doing? So really analyzing the performance of your distribution channels that you have, right? And do we have the right ICP? Do we have the right market segmentation? Is there a mismatch in the way that we are positioning in the market, and so on and so forth? So typically it's that efficiency, productivity, if you will, of the distribution channels. And I use the word distribution because it could be your own sales team. You could have a channel partner ecosystem that you're driving things through. So you really need to sort of be looking at the entire sort of way in which you reach your customers. The second bucket has to do with your people. So there's a lot of analysis done on how did your people do in terms of their productivity, how did they do in terms of the knowledge base, the enablement level of the organization, as well as managers and how they did in terms of managing the teams and so on. So it's more of a people analysis of, do you have the right people trained up in the right roles in order to sort of help with the distribution motion. And the third bucket tends to be related to the product. So the product more in terms of how it's supporting the distribution motion, the go-to-market motion. So that's really where you're trying to understand if you have the right packaging, the right pricing levels, the right promotions, the right approach to reaching the market. And so you really want to kind of look at what's working, what's not working in the different segments. As you said, Anthony, the enterprise segment behaves entirely different from how an SMB segment might work, or the type of motion that's needed there. Maybe you take a product-led growth approach in your SMB space compared to your enterprise space. So that then comes down to how your product is really set up to support the go-to-market motion. So I tend to think of it as those three buckets, and typically in the analysis, it tends to be three different bunch of people that you're working with, because when you're looking at your distribution, you're typically working with your sales leadership and the management team in terms of understanding the people. And then you're working with HR and people managers in terms of understanding how your people are doing, how they're being enabled, how they're being trained, how you're hiring them. Do we have the right skills for the people that we're hiring? And the product discussion tends to be with your product P&L owners or your GMs of the products who have their own goals and objectives and things that they want to understand, right? So it's always a collaborative effort throughout the organization, and typically you end up with these groups of people that you have to sort of work with to understand performance and where things are working really well and where things are not, so that you can sort of come up with options.
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, just to tee off Bala a little bit, is just I always, from our perspective, is we just try to understand, which territories performed really, really well over this last year and which ones did not, and then really ask the question why. And that typically is like digging into different factors that like highly correlate to like what is a really good territory in terms of, okay, let's say we added a ton of this type of industry in this territory and it did really well, and this industry didn't do so well, and that's in another territory. So that helps us just inform, how do we build better territories across our resources or sales teams, so they're more balanced for next year. And that's really just, it's not just a matter of like, let's go put 500 accounts in each territory, but there's more to it, and you want to get better at that over year. And so understanding why a territory did really well versus maybe not is also important.
Yeah, I think the people as I think
I'm going to ask a question, Anthony, real quick.
Yeah,
Ask you a question since it was quiet, and I'm going to cut you off. I know you were going to probably say something super important, but I'm going to cut you off anyway. I'm curious on your approach for the segmentation piece. You know how like we always talk about like, yeah, certainly there's like a different sales process or sales motion for velocity or SMB and enterprise. Like, have you seen in your world just like cutting that at a specific line, like let's say 250 employees and just call it good? Or is there like an analysis that you do to really figure out where that line should be? And the reason I ask that is like, I've seen some customers do this, and some customers, come to us and they're like, these are our lines, and they never really look at it, and that's just the way it is. But I don't know if there's like a deeper analysis you can do to really understand where that line break is.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And no, it looks really different everywhere. So we do planning and we manage RevOps for tons of companies now. So I've gotten to see it in a lot of different ways. And I thought there'd be a good natural, like back of napkin math, hey, cut off SMB here, enterprise here. But it's really because a lot of it depends on your product, your go-to-market strategy. And I'd say the more important thing is, what is the process to acquire a customer? So and what type of people do you need in order to close that gap? So if you need somebody, I'll give you an example. So Lean Scale, we mainly work with smaller companies. These would be like the SMB of the SMBs for most companies. So we're working anywhere from somebody who just did a Series A and up to Series C, Series D. But we're typically interacting with founders or executives within that company. So our sales process is actually pretty complex, and we need to really know what we're talking about and be highly educated on what we're selling in order to close one of those deals. So I don't know if there's a good like firmographic line you could draw in the sand. I think it has to do with what type of people do you need to go close those deals, and how complex is the process? Because there's also other products where, maybe it's more product-led growth. You can go get enterprise accounts without anybody even talking to anyone. Yeah. So you may not need to change your motion too much.
Yeah, great. Sorry to take over that. Were you
No, it's a really good question.
Yeah, thanks. Were you going to say something else?
It's related to that. I was going to say the people portion is so important. And I think sometimes is overlooked, but making sure you have the right talent profile for the job on hand, and you're getting your best people in the best territories. Yeah. Super important. So just like that, like if you have an enterprise segment, okay, let's make sure we put people who can go handle that enterprise sales motion.
Great.
I think we have a question.
Yeah, I see a question here. So you had mentioned, it says, you mentioned how your approach to analysis has changed over the years. Anthony, curious to hear your key takeaways from that.
Oh, well, So many, I don't know where to begin. One, I think just the orientation and mindset that we would have when we'd approach planning. I came up through SaaS during some pretty good times. Capital was pretty easy to get. A lot of outbound strategies were working pretty well and they're pretty predictable. So planning was actually a little bit easier because one, we knew we could get funding if we needed it. And we also could predict, a typical sales capacity plan. Let's go get X amount of reps. Let's go support them with Y amount of SDRs. And then let's go fill the plan and go out in the market, bang on doors and go get the deals. And that actually worked and it was fine. Then I think after, 2020, 21, definitely last year, the whole thing changed. So also indexing on growth at all costs really wasn't being rewarded. It's not sustainable. So you had to get very focused on doing things efficiently. And the market's a lot more sophisticated for most of these tools. And it's very tough to just do like hit the streets outbound type of work. So it's a lot more nuanced. You need to invest much more in thought leadership, content creation. You have to really, really have a good partnership or channel strategy most of the time. So these things are also a little bit more difficult to analyze and calculate. So it requires even more business context and even more assumptions built into your model. So the data set has just exponentially increased. It's gotten more difficult to predict, and you have to really focus on growth and efficiency at the same time. I'd say those are the big differences.
Yeah, the one other big difference that I've seen, and again, tagging on to what you were saying, Anthony, over the past 3 years or so, there's been a lot of demand to do and redo the numbers many, many times, right? So it's typically not the annual sort of stable plan that you can sort of put together and then kind of rely on it throughout the year. We've seen casting and recasting done pretty much on a quarterly basis, right? And that's as the market conditions are changing and people have been asked to either become more efficient or figure out what's not working so you can sort of target the markets appropriately. And in our customer base, that's sort of what we've noticed as well, as this sort of this idea of a big annual, big bang kind of approach is sort of slowly going away. And what we're seeing is people tweaking aspects of the plan throughout the year. So they may change, some aspects of the plan mid-year. They may change the markets they're going after, or they may try and drive a particular sales program on a hypothesis that's not working out. So they want to, switch it around and do something else. So we've seen a lot of that, sort of this micro planning kind of activity happening throughout the year in terms of just the process itself and what the RevOps teams have been asked to do. Tyler, I know you're much more closer to seeing that from our customers. What are you noticing there?
It's just tweaking. That's the word that I landed on, is just you're starting to see, like everyone's still doing this annual planning exercise, and there's a lot of work that does get done and a lot of good work, just like understanding, what are we going to do next year and set things up. But it's certainly not a set it and forget it thing anymore. And everyone is constantly it's just like every month you're analyzing, what did we do, what went well, what didn't go well, how are we going to tweak it? And then to your point, Bala, like every quarter everyone's, we're going to add this vertical, or maybe we'll adjust the lines a little bit, or we're going to add headcount, or whatever it might be. Like it's just this consistent tweaking process that's happening throughout the year.
And we've seen that, tick up quite a bit in the last 3 years, especially with COVID and as businesses were trying to respond to that. And now with the tight market, especially in the tech space, there's a lot of pressure on getting more efficient. To your point, Anthony, capital is not freely available anymore. And so you really have to be efficient in how you're driving your business, especially sales. And, the sales industry attainment numbers are pretty pathetic. They're somewhere around 50% or so, and they've been hovering around that range. And so it is a high cost item for organizations. And so naturally, it's one of those areas that they want to tweak and make sure are being more efficient. So we've seen a lot of that in the last 3 years, I would say.
I totally agree. I think the velocity at which you need to replan is way more now than it ever was before. And I guess just because conditions are changing faster too.
Right.
I think people can launch products faster now than they could a while ago. There's more M&A going on that changes dynamics. I think things just move quicker, so your plan has to be really, really agile. I almost think of an annual plan as like, when you do like a 5-year plan, like, I just kind of want a North Star of kind of where we're going. I feel like that's what the annual plan has turned into. And then to your point, Bala, that quarterly plan is the one like, okay, we're actually funding this. We're going to go hire these people and do it.
Right.
Awesome.
All right. We have another question. Do you want to read that out, Ashley, or do you want me to?
Yeah.
All right. So how does your experience overlay with the work that finance might be doing on their side from an annual planning perspective, if at all? And can you speak to who is responsible for what portion of the analysis and what metrics or data points each team tends to be responsible for? So basically, what does finance do? What does RevOps do? And what's sort of the division of labor, if you will, between the two organizations?
I think it depends on what type of RevOps team you have.
Yeah.
Some companies don't even have RevOps, so you may not even have a team. Ideally, if you were to, and I think you all have done a really good job of outlining the maturity model of a ops team. If you have like no ops, then you have siloed ops, and then you get like your first version of RevOps, which is maybe firefighting on systems. But if you get a mature RevOps team with really good leadership, data on hand to make decisions, I think anything on the go-to-market side that you'd be using in your model should be coming from RevOps. And I personally, maybe this is just me because I like to do planning, but I like RevOps owning the go-to-market portion of the operating plan. I mean, things like conversion rates, sales cycles, performance to plan, cost ratios, customer acquisition cost, lifetime value. I mean, all of that, RevOps should, one, have access to all the data and be more, be more intelligent on the data that's being used to do that, but also have more business context. You're in the field with the team every day. So hey, is that conversion rate something we should use to project in the future? Or are there some weird anomalies that we got to call out in that? And your RevOps team should be the best person or the best team to do that.
Well, I agree. I've seen everything from the finance team basically providing the sales objectives, right? So they'll say, we got to hit this much revenue, and here's your expense envelope to do it with. And then just hand off that whole problem to, as you said, Anthony, a mature RevOps organization or a strategy organization that can take that problem and then go, okay, we have this much money to get to this goal. How do we build the resources, and what do we need to hire? How do we organize the distribution teams in a way that we can get to that goal? I've seen finance teams get really involved on the quota setting side. So really kind of get involved in understanding things like productivity, ramp, and those kinds of things to really kind of get to a quota model and a compensation model that makes sense. In that sort of situation, again, depending on the maturity of the RevOps organization, you have the RevOps teams typically providing those key assumptions that finance may use in the quota planning process or the quota modeling process. So that happens, and typically that's a aspect of who's reporting to who. Sometimes the quota teams are reporting into finance and not into the RevOps organization. So it's partly a structure of the organization as well as kind of where the skill sets lie. And I agree with you, Anthony. I think the RevOps teams are much closer to the details of the plan as compared to the finance teams, in the sense that you understand what ramp is, you understand whether it's a realistic thing to be using in an assumption, and also how do you actually distribute accounts down to the specific reps and the book of business, and how do you set goals on those specific books of business. I think the revenue ops teams in collaboration with the sales managers are much more closer to that problem than most finance teams are. So I don't know if that fully answers the question. Feel free to shoot any follow-on questions if you have any, or Anthony or Tyler, if you want to add on to that. Any other thoughts?
I just wanted to add one thing, because I don't want to say like, hey, finance, we don't really need you. We'll take it from here. Thanks. Because I don't want that to be the sentiment. That's not what I'm saying. What I do really appreciate from a finance team is understanding and providing the top-down guidance. So when we talk about doing planning, it really has to, I think, it really has to start from top-down guidance. What are we trying to do? Are we trying to march towards an acquisition, an IPO? Are we trying to raise funding? And what do we need in order to do that? Team, how can we do that? What's the bottom-up plan to do that? And then keep revising as you go. But I really think that top-down guidance has to come from the CFO, partnering with the CEO, and then challenging the RevOps team to do things as efficiently and productively as possible.
And I think the other thing that typically is a lot of friction between these teams is visibility, right? And so both teams want to understand the key assumptions that are being used, because obviously finance wants to make sure that the numbers that are being committed to are actually closer to the pin, and they want to get confidence that they're in fact closer to the pin and thought through. And in the same way, I think the RevOps teams wants to understand why the target, why the expense envelope, why only this much headcount, where is that coming from, and what's the guiding factors behind that. So that collaboration is super important to make sure you have a working, coherent plan at the end of the day.
Yeah, and then I will only just say that majority of our customers do exactly what we're talking about, which is tops down guidance comes from finance, some sort of expense envelope. Here's how many people you can, essentially, here's how many people you can hire or have, go figure it out. RevOps does the bottoms up, and then there's a discussion that needs to be had typically around how do we reconcile these two things. And that's just,
they're not going to match. I thought it just like goes 1-to-1 every time.
No, typically it's a bunch of painful discussions to be had, right? And those are always fun.
Yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Right, while we're waiting for some more questions, I did have one jotted down here, Anthony, just based on what you were mentioning earlier, as far as like the common challenges that you see, both, I guess, for the customer size that you're working with in amongst your clients, as well as maybe on the bigger side too. Like if you could identify a few of the top challenges that you commonly encounter during this analysis phase of the planning process.
One, almost every single time you're missing some kind of data that you really want in the model. And a lot of companies don't have the foundation set to track some of the basics that you really need. So one, do you have really good definitions of your staging. At Lean Scale, we call it the go-to-market life cycle. So from lead to opportunity to close to renewal to churn, do you have really well-defined definitions, entry exit criteria across that whole cycle? Most people don't, and there's some ambiguity in the definitions. Then do you have the right markers to track when things are going through the funnel, when things are flowing back into nurture flows? And then do you have the right markers to track amounts as they go through? So I think a lot of the foundations and groundwork to get the basic data you need to build the model is usually not there. So that's challenge number one. And it's a tough one because it can be difficult to go back and paint a historical picture too. So if you haven't been tracking it this whole time, it's tough to go from today and try to figure out what happened in the past. So every day you're wasting not having that, you're not going to have it for the future. And then challenge number two, which I think everybody was laughing here, is just aligning the teams. So getting sales, marketing, customer success, ops, finance, the rest of the executive leadership team aligned on a plan and interlocked, and having a very clear understanding of the assumptions we're putting in the model, the best data we have to build something for the future, and then going out and executing against it and not leaving that room thinking like they don't believe in it or something. I think the team alignment is really, really, really challenging because you have so many competing personalities as well as competing priorities. So yeah, managing that is very difficult.
Yeah, I also learned this term HIPPO, which means the highest paid person in the room. Typically is the one driving the discussion. And so, that tends to sort of take things and veer off in strange directions, So that's also things that I've seen happen. But you're absolutely right. I think one of the key challenges with data is that if you're not consistently collecting it, then it's hard to use that data going forward. I've seen situations where you might start off with the stages clearly defined at the beginning of the year, but then you change it 7 times throughout the year, and so now you can't run any report that's meaningful to say what actually happened. And also, one thing that I've also noticed is a lot of selection bias in the data. Right, so you may actually be doing really well in a particular segment because that's the segment you've been focused on, and so people tend to sort of be unaware of the bias that that may exist in the data itself based on kind of past performance, especially for growing companies. That is always the risk where you tend to assume that the data that you're looking at is bias free, right? But you tend to have a lot of bias in the data. So it's important to sort of figure that out as well. And not just look at your CRM for analysis, but also kind of look at other data sources, especially when you're young and mature as an organization. You really want to be aware of that.
I have nothing to add. Everyone else hit everything perfectly. The only thing I might say, I don't know, I'm just trying to add whatever on the end here. So the only thing I might say with I think a lot of people during the analysis of annual planning also skip over just what do we want to call it? Just feedback from the sales team. So they're just looking at the data. I mean, data in itself and having the right stuff tracked is number one. That is the biggest problem we see across customers and in planning. But certainly, are they even talking to salespeople to hear what those common challenges were for the last year in their territories and what the things that they're coming up with? And I think that gets skipped over a lot during the analysis. And that, yes, that is more of a soft piece of data, if you want to call it that, than actual this was our conversion rate, but it does play into the ultimate go to market and how you think about your teams, and going back to Anthony and aligning teams and making things work the way you want it to. So that's something that's super important, and it's difficult to collect, right? And you got to kind of sift through what is the biases and not, and really understand that. So,
well, you need to get Anthony in there early so he can tell you all the data you need to collect. Right? So you can do the
start
analysis.
there.
That setup is so foundational, right? I mean, if you especially year later, you're trying to look at what worked and what didn't. Well, if you didn't collect the data, you're not going to be able to answer that. And even if you did collect the data, typically things that the data explicitly calls out tends to get fixed pretty quickly. And what I find is when you're going through this analysis, the things that you're sort of trying to grapple with are things that the data is sort of suggesting or insinuating might be the issue, but you're not exactly sure. So you really have to pull in a number of different data points to sort of get to a hypothesis on what exactly might be the problem. I find that if productivity or something is clearly called out in the data and everybody sees the data and says, oh, we got to go fix it, it usually tends to get fixed right away. Right? And things that are more problematic are the ones that you encounter during the analysis later on. I think we have a follow-on question, if I call out, is how do you approach using industry standards or benchmarks in your performance analysis? If so, how has this influenced your planning? Anthony, do you want to?
Yeah, I think it's just a good gut check. I don't try to set goals or prescribe an industry standard to any individual company, because like we're talking about here, there's so much context as to why a business may be operating the way that it is, and you have to play to that business's particular strengths. But I do use it to gut check if something seems way off. Hey, we're in market in EMEA and our sales cycle tripled. Should your sales cycle triple from North America to EMEA? I know it should be a little bit longer, but should it be that much longer? And then so looking at some benchmark data, we're lucky at Lean Scale because we have a lot of companies we can just go in and see like, hey, who's a like company, and see if that makes sense. But that's how I use it, just as a gut check, see if any crazy anomalies that are in my data set, let me just go benchmark that. And then how much confidence do I have in the model that I put together? If I feel good about it, I feel like I have the right subjective information like Tyler was bringing in, because I think that's super important. And then on top of that, I layer in, oh, also, by the way, this is at benchmark standard with like companies, then it just adds a layer of confidence to what I'm doing.
Oh, absolutely agree. I think, the way I think about it is that there's obviously lots of benchmark data that's available in a whole bunch of different topics, right? And some of them you'll have a lot more confidence with adopting it or gut checking against, and some of them maybe not so much, right? So examples, like if you are trying to figure out how much you should pay an AE in a particular region, right? Mm-hmm. Those numbers tend to be pretty well defined, and you get the market numbers, and you're sort of trying to estimate against what the market is sort of driving towards. And so pay data, like PayScale or some of these companies would provide you with that information, which is tremendously helpful if you're trying to figure out what the OTE ought to be for your reps in the different regions and so on. So that kind of data, I've seen consumed as is into models, because that's the best thing you're going to get is what's the current market conditions, and you use it. There are other kinds of sort of market numbers, like for instance, specifically during the last year, what we consistently kept hearing from tech companies is that the sales cycles are taking longer. Right, and so that was a consistent message that we were hearing from industry benchmarks and numbers, and we're seeing sort of a 3 to 5 month extension of sales cycles, and so that's something that we can then check against how we're doing and say, yeah, maybe everyone's experiencing the same kind of problem or the same kind of issues that we're seeing in the industry. But some of the other numbers, like for instance, how much quota should someone carry? What is, how many accounts do you need to put into a territory? How many phone calls can a SDR make? There are benchmark numbers for that. I tend to use those with caution because the context of the business and your sales motion really matters in sort of how those numbers come about. But if, to Anthony's point, if the benchmark says an SDR can make 10 calls during the day and you are putting in an assumption to make 50 calls during the day, maybe something is off, right? So from a gut check standpoint, I think they're certainly helpful. But again, you want to make sure that the context of your business is taken into account there.
I do like using pay data.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good benchmark. I'm happy you brought that up because it's a pretty concrete one that you can use.
Right. I'll throw another question out there in terms of forward-looking metrics. And obviously, we've talked about numbers, looking back at your business and looking back at how we've performed. One of the critical things during planning is forward-looking, right? What does next year look like, and what kind of things do you look for in your metrics? What kind of metrics do you look for to sort of give you that forward-looking perspective into the next year?
Couple of areas. This might sound counterintuitive, but I actually like to start with the customer base. I know that people tend to think like, oh, that's at the very end of the funnel. And before I did RevOps, I did CS. So I have a special place in my heart for that business function. And I think you get so much really valuable data from listening to your customers, seeing how they're using your product, really doing a deep dive on churn. So, I mean, your churn data is probably some of your most valuable data to foreshadow what's going on. Are they going to competitors? Are they not getting ramped up quick enough? Are they not realizing the full value? They're not understanding how to use your product? Because eventually, if you start to churn a lot of accounts, especially for the wrong reasons, then that could be a really, really negative impact in the future. So I start there, and then I look for any positive signals or the things that we can amplify in our marketing and branding. So why do customers love our product? What features are they absolutely obsessed about? And how can we really fine tune and tailor the messaging? So, because likely other people have a similar problem. And then which markets love us? Which markets don't care too much about us? And go find your evangelists and see where they're living in your customer base. And then maybe that's a good place to take back to your branding and marketing. So I start there, and then I really like super top of funnel branding metrics. How are you interacting with the market? How much content are you producing? How many followers does your company have on LinkedIn or any other social media platforms you're using? I know that sometimes feels like fuzzy math and fuzzy logic, and I don't use it to discreetly create a forecast, but I do use it to see. Most of these companies are private, but it's like, what's our stock on the market like? And that's probably the closest you can get to having a sense for market perception. How much is the market interacting with your brand?
Yeah. I've seen a lot of sort of marketing metrics used in that context, right? So specifically, how is a particular region, for instance, responding to your marketing messages? To your point, right? Are we getting lead performance at the levels that we expect? Are we, getting competitive pressure in certain segments? So the win-loss analysis, as you said, is where a lot of that sort of nuggets are buried. But yeah, I mean, that kind of stuff, lead volumes, lead performance, things such as open pipe and whatnot sort of give you an indication to sort of double check where we think the market looks like. And the other thing that I've seen people use is intent data from third parties, right? And so I think there is a growing set of companies that actually give you intent information and that can also be used to sort of figure out the propensity for a particular market to respond to the way that you want it to. So those are some of the things, because I know when you're doing analysis, it's always easy to just go look at the look at the data that you have from past performance, but the future side of it is also just as important, I think, in the consideration. Tyler, anything that you've seen with customers using?
I think, geez, you guys say everything. You don't leave anything left for me over there. So, I think for, really it's the top of funnel stuff is really key to understanding, what could do really well if you're going to, allocate more resources to it. Because like when it comes to planning and thinking about like the go-to-market motion and where you're going to put people, that's where you want to understand, okay, like top of funnel stuff, the propensity or intent data that you brought up, Bala, is super huge in understanding, like, okay, well, like think about you're expanding in APAC, like, are you getting a ton of leads from Vietnam, or do you even have open pipeline in Vietnam, or like, what does intent data look like there if you can get it, right? And like, is it worth putting somebody in this country or like working Southeast Asia? Like, those are those types of questions that looking at those kind of like three, for me, like those three pieces would be huge. And I guess, sorry, four, because customer data is also huge, because maybe you actually have a couple of customers that you never realized that were based in Southeast Asia, and understanding that would be key. So that's kind of really me just summarizing what you two had just said. So there you go. You're welcome, everybody. I think we're ready for another question, Ashley. Simon, what's a mistake you've made that changed the way you do analysis?
Which one do you want to start with? I'm still making a few. I think for me, the first one that just stood out, like, and I just feel stupid for not even thinking about it. In a sales capacity model, I didn't account for attrition. So I was like, oh, we got all of our people, all these people love our company, we're gonna go hire these people, they're all gonna be rock stars, and they're all gonna love us and stay. And I'm super smart because I'm accounting for ramp time, including pipeline build. The model's like perfect. And then we had like 2 top reps quit, and then 2 people we hired like bail, and then and it completely threw off the whole model. So for sales capacity planning specifically, I really like to make sure that I have attrition baked in. Any capacity, CS capacity, anything like that. But in particular, sales can throw off the model quite a bit if you don't account for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing I alluded to earlier, which was a big realization for me, is the bias in the data. And we can build these models with like very specific numbers and things that we have gathered from metrics that we calculate. But it's super important to sort of step back and look at it and go, what are the inherent biases in the data that I'm not seeing, right? And we one particular incident that's sort of etched in my brain is, we put together this huge analysis of how we ought to go into this particular vertical, and we spent all this time building up these models about how perfect it is for us to go into that particular vertical and why we should double down and so on. And we do the presentation to the sales managers, and they go, well, what data did you use for this? It was, we used our CRM data, and we looked at kind of past performance and so on. We had years of CRM data. And then come to find out that they, at the business level, had made a decision many years back not to go into a particular vertical. And so they didn't buy any data from it. They didn't put anything in the CRM, and they didn't do business with it. But I just came in 2 years ago, and I'm missing a bunch of context of decisions made in the past. And the data didn't show that. And so they were like, well, what about this industry that we decided 3 years ago never to go into? Oh, we did that? Well, that's not in the data, right? And so I think it's important to sort of always kind of, the metrics are great, but you ought to step back and at the strategic level really think about what biases might be in the data because I'm looking at a specific subset. And we had to go redo everything again. But that's tripped me up a few times in terms of, because you tend to get, as Anthony, you say, once you're building your model, you tend to get really into it, and it's like this beautiful model, and you got all the numbers and metrics right. But the fact that you have a number doesn't mean it's the right number. and so it's important to sort of step back and look at that. I think that would be my mistake I've made a few times.
Control S for me. I don't know. Like there's so many times where I've had like this whole spreadsheet built, and I mean I know there's autosave and stuff. I don't trust it, and then Excel quits on the whole thing, and then you got to start from scratch. So that's my joke.
That's why you shouldn't be doing it in Excel.
Yeah. Well, yeah. The challenging, like not challenging the assumptions that you have or that you had from last year. So going back to like gut checking against like benchmarks, or like, this is our conversion rate is blah, and you kind of just, that's what it's been for the whole year. And you're not actually like going back to look at that data because you're just trying to do it quick and get it done. So just making sure that you are using the right metrics and conversion rates, numbers, whatever that might be, in the analysis.
I want to piggyback a little bit off of what Paul said about not bringing business context into it, and also not bringing people context into it. It's like Paul was saying, you show up, you have this beautiful model, you're so excited, you're so proud of it. It's so like complex, you're crashing Excel. And then if you don't get people bought in before you go present it. So I think the pre-meeting, like, hey, before you go show up to like the official planning meeting, go run it by your head of sales, run it by your head of marketing, run it by your head of CS, run it by your head of product, because most models will have some product information baked in there too. And do a pre-meeting before you go in, and then just get lit up by an entire executive team who's like yelling at you about the assumptions you made about their business that they know best. That's pretty, I don't know, maybe it's just me, maybe I was
it's not
arrogant walking into those processes. I was like, don't worry, I know the data, I'll tell you what your model is. And then they're like, listen.
No, that's not just you. I think that's happened to me countless times, and it is so important to get people aligned. Even simple things like, how do you calculate a particular metric, right? Because you could show up, I've shown up to meetings where I put up a number, and the head of sales goes, well, my number looks slightly different than that. And you go, well, how could that be? And then we'll say, well, we calculated with this in mind and that in mind. And, we come up with our own numbers. So every organization tends to have a different definition of what a conversion rate is or what a win rate is. And, is competitors included in the win rate or not included in the win rate, right? Simple things like that could just come up and bite you if you don't get those things aligned. To your point, Anthony, like getting the organization aligned around some of these key definitions are so important to successfully pulling this together.
Absolutely.
As the official timekeeper, we're actually drawing up at the end of the time that we had set aside. So I wanted to see if we want to do a really quick, what is the silver bullet takeaway, I don't know, words of wisdom, motivation, or inspiration for people here as far as they, when they're approaching their analysis phase of their annual planning process. Anyone want to go first?
I'll take it. Reverse engineer your funnel, layer in as much business context as possible, and align everybody on the plan and get all of your definitions just bulletproof.
I think I'll echo that as well. And keep an eye on the time it takes to do that, because you could really get lost in the data, and then you have to drive timelines for these discussions, and it's important to make sure that you are keeping to those timelines as well.
And for me, we didn't really talk about this, but it's my silver bullet anyway, because I love to just, I mean, one, yeah, the subjective information, don't forget about that, right? So I guess that's the silver bullet we talked about. But for me, it's also like asking why, like not just the single time, but this has come up a ton in our fireside chats, where we always talk about like asking why multiple times to like get down to like the root piece of the data. And I think that that's super important for things that are really critical in your go-to-market.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, great. Thank you. I was going to flash up this one more fancy slide. So thank you so much, Anthony, for sharing your time and your insights with us today. For everybody who signed up or tuned in, we'll go ahead and share a recording of this within the next couple of days. So keep an eye out for that. And for next week, we have our third session of the series talking about everything segmentation. So be sure to check that one out as well. Thank you again, Anthony. Thank you, Tyler, Bala, and everybody who joined in. We will see you next time.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
Take care.